But I see now it is 5:30, and a very warm welcome everybody who's watching or listening this afternoon, or who'll be watching or listening later. On Mondays, we've started a series looking at people throughout history who have been influential in various ways. Because it's Holy Week, the Monday of Holy Week, this time we're looking at someone from the Bible. In most churches around the world, when they say the creed in whatever language, they use this phrase or something like it about Jesus: suffered under Pontius Pilate. And that's partly because those who put the creed together wanted to remind everybody that the life and death and resurrection of Jesus was all included in real history. So they tie it to a real historical character, Pontius Pilate. And we know a fair bit about Pilate because historians outside the biblical writers wrote about him: Josephus, Tacitus, and Philo. And so we know a little bit about him. And the gospel writers wrote about him as well. We know from the other writers that he was governor in Judea, Israel, for about 10 years, about AD 26/7 to AD 36/7, which was quite a long time to be a governor of a province. Being governor of Judea was not the plum job in the Roman Empire, but it wasn't a bad one, and it was fairly respected because everybody knew it was quite a difficult calling. Pilate did do a couple of things which got him into trouble earlier on. He brought some imperial standards into Jerusalem with the image of the emperor on them. That did not go well among a faithful people who didn't like any idea of worshipping anybody else than the true God. And of course, the Roman emperors were sometimes seen as divine. That didn't go well. He also diverted money that was meant for the temple to pay for a new aqueduct to bring water into Jerusalem. Would have seemed a good idea, but it wasn't really his money to use. That did not go down well either. We learn from Luke in the Bible that at one point he seemed to mingle the blood of Galileans with sacrifices. We're not quite sure when that refers to, but clearly that wouldn't have gone down well either. And then on Good Friday, he's faced with a dilemma. And during these few minutes, I'm going to look at 7 aspects of what happened on that Friday. This isn't a thorough account about Pilate, but more because it's Holy Week. What can we learn from what he did and what he said? First of all, we note that the high priests brought Jesus to him early on Friday morning for a trial. That means that Pilate must have been warned, almost certainly the night before, that yes, we've caught him, we want a trial tomorrow early. And so he's there wondering what all this is about. This is Passover week, and it's the last week that he wants a big fuss, because Passover in Jerusalem, full of people celebrating liberation, memories of Moses, and looking forward to the promised land, etc. And the Romans are the occupying oppressive force. Pilate wants things kept quiet. Jesus is brought in front of him, and there are various conversations. 7 things that happen through the day. First of all 4 gospel writers record that Pilate asks this question: "Are you the king?" And we don't quite know in what tone of voice he asks it. Jesus is battered and exhausted by this stage, but Pilate asks it. Is it purely sarcastic? Is he intrigued? Does he want to know how Jesus thinks of himself? Does he ask it to annoy the watching religious leaders? Last thing they want is for Pilate to think that Jesus has any validity at all. Are you the king? And perhaps Jesus thought, well, that question has been asked of me throughout my life. And when he was born at Bethlehem, that was the question that Herod, the Great in Jerusalem, was asking. Is this the king? Is this the one with royal blood, descended from David? Is he a threat? Do I need to kill all the babies in Bethlehem just in case? When the Magi appear, they bring gold as well as frankincense and myrrh, the sign of a king. When Jesus is older, he talks about bringing in the kingdom. Is he the king? And so Pilate asks that question, and perhaps for us in Holy Week, it's a good question to ponder. Is Jesus the king? And if so, what does that mean for our world, for our lives? Second question, and perhaps this is one of the most famous things that Pilate asks: what is truth? And again, we don't quite know how he asks it to Jesus. Sarcastic, mocking, intrigued. What does this preacher from the north really think about truth? What is truth? And again, likewise for us, how do we ask that question? What is truth? What is real? Where do we find integrity? How much does it matter to us? One commentator said, Pilate asks the question, what is truth, and then walks away without hearing the answer. That may be slightly unfair. Maybe Jesus just was staying silent at that point. But for us, it's a good question. What is truth? How much do we value it? Thirdly, it's very clear early on that Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent, but he was being pushed, and he was being pushed by lots of pressures. The high priests led by Caiaphas. Now, Caiaphas and Pilate would have known each other well. Caiaphas became high priest in AD 18, so was already in post for about 8 to 9 years before Pilate appears. So they would have worked quite closely together. Caiaphas is a key player in Jerusalem. He runs the temple. And the temple is not only the center of worship, but the economic center as well, employs a lot of people. Caiaphas has significant power entrusted to him by the Romans, but he comes from a ruling family who have been involved in politics and power for many years. Pilate knows him well. Caiaphas wants Jesus executed. Pilate doesn't particularly want to be pushed. But Caiaphas knows which buttons to press. And as the day goes on, Caiaphas gets increasingly frustrated because Pilate isn't rushing to execute Jesus. So he ends up saying things, if you don't execute him, you are no friend of Caesar. And the word friend of Caesar is not just an informal word, but represented a group of people who could be seen in Caesar's probably not inner circle, but outer circle. Pilate was from sort of the second class of people. In medieval English terms, he would have been a knight, not a baron or a lord, but a knight. And Caiaphas is saying, if you let off Jesus, then you are no friend of Caesar. Caesar is the Emperor Tiberius. Already a letter of complaint has gone to Tiberius about Pilate because of previous behavior. And Pilate knows that his position may not be absolutely solid, and he doesn't want that letter to go to Rome. There's also, of course, the crowd that shouts, crucify, crucify. Almost certainly not the same crowd as on Palm Sunday shouts, Hosanna to the Son of David. Not the same crowd. And it seems that by Friday, the chief priests and the religious leaders had ensured that the crowd that Pilate was hearing was their own particular crowd, and they wanted to say, crucify, crucify. We remember that during the whole week, the religious leaders were scared of the crowd, so would not arrest Jesus publicly. And there's no evidence at all that the great mass of people, the ordinary people who loved Jesus, had turned against him. And so the crowd in front of Pilate, in quite a special, privileged area, they knew what to shout. So there was pressure there as well. But maybe there was a little bit of internal pressure too, and we'll come back to that. Fourthly, the washing his hands part. We may know that Pilate says, I give you the decision. I wash my hands of this choice. This is for you. Now, legally, in fact, he could not do that. But it just perhaps makes us think, when do we wash our hands of a decision that should be ours? When do we abnegate responsibility, which we should be taking? And perhaps as we think about the roles that we have in our lives, in our workplaces, homes, wherever it may be, if we're called to take responsibility, then it's not for us just to pass it back. Jesus is taken away and he is crucified. And the fifth thing is that Pilate then says, I'm going to put a sign above the cross, and the sign will say, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And the high priests are furious, and they say, no, either take it down or put, this man said, this liar said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And Pilate says, what I have written stays written. And he writes it in all the main languages of the day, so all the passers-by can recognize what's being said about him. So although he's being pushed by the religious leaders, he's also making a point, I am in charge, and perhaps inadvertently witnessing to a truth that the Christian church will then proclaim for the next 2,000 years. Perhaps it's important for us to remember that unexpected people may sometimes show honor to Jesus, honor to faith, honor to belief in God, and that it's great if that can be remembered and stuck with. Then later on that evening, I just need to keep an eye on the time, got to number 6. He responds positively to Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea comes along and says, please can I take the body down and put it in a tomb and make sure it's looked after properly. Now, Pilate had had a difficult day throughout it all, lots of toing and froing. But at that point, the door was open. He responded to Joseph of Arimathea and said, yes, you can do this. He's still in control and responds positively there. Perhaps for us, just to flip it round a bit, Joseph of Arimathea this was a brave thing to do. And you and I may be sometimes called to have a brave conversation with someone in authority. To knock on Pilate's door at the end of that Friday would have been a brave thing to do. And Joseph of Arimathea did that. And likewise for us, if ever we have to have courageous conversations, we maybe can remember that moment. We've done 6. Pilate says, are you the king? And that's the big question about Jesus. Then he asks, what is truth? Where are we in that search? And then the fact that he knew that Jesus was innocent, but various forces were pushing him. He was under pressure just to execute this person. He holds against it for a bit, but he just wants to do a bit of testing along the way. And then we may wish to think about what pressures us and how we cope with that. He then washes his hands. I give you the responsibility. And in fact, it wasn't his to give away. And then he writes the sign, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, responds positively to Joseph of Arimathea. So he perhaps, and we now get to the 7th, he perhaps went to bed feeling, well, it was a very tricky day. I'm quite annoyed that I had to get up early to do all this. I don't really understand what the fuss was all about, but this carpenter's son is now dead. My old friend Caiaphas, whom I'm a bit cross with today, but he's relatively satisfied. But also he would be thinking 2 other things, and this maybe goes back to the inner pressures for him to keep the conversation going through the day. First of all, it's recorded that at some point, certainly in the morning, he sends Jesus to Herod Antipas. And Herod is the leader in the north, but is in Jerusalem for the Passover, and they become friends from that moment. And that's quite an important political win for Pilate, because he and Herod can now work more closely together. That feels good. And secondly, there is a key moment when he's really pushing the religious leaders, and he says, shall I crucify your king? Pilate asks. And they've run out of places to hide, and they say, we have no king but Caesar. The chief priests answered. That for the chief priests in Jerusalem, in Judea, is an enormous handing over to the power of Rome. And imagine if Tiberius had heard that Pilate had managed to get that confession out of them. We have no king but Caesar. That's a real win for Pilate. So he probably went to bed thinking, that's quite a good day. That was Friday. Sunday comes and it blows it all apart. For Caiaphas, the high priests, for Pilate and the Romans, and as time goes on, and so on. More of that later in the week. But although Pilate may have felt, well, it was a tricky day, but it finished well. This chap was executed. I got this affirmation, we have no king but Caesar, from the chief priests. I'm friend with Herod. It's all gone pretty much without disaster, and there has not been a riot during Passover week. There could have been today, but there wasn't. That's good news as well. So Pilate perhaps felt it had been a good day. Within 3 years, he is recalled to Rome because he oppresses a rebellion among the Samaritans too violently. And the Romans were quite sensitive about how such things should be handled. Pilate's cruelty had got the better of him again, and he's recalled to Rome. Perhaps just a reminder for us that short-term victories, especially when they're carried out with manipulation, with power play, with a little bit of deceit, may feel good it may feel good in the short term, but long term we may not win. And so Pilate is remembered week by week as people say their creeds. Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. And perhaps as we look forward to this Holy Week, we might think about our reactions, how we would have felt that Friday, and what we can learn from Pilate and about Pilate. Thank you so much for listening this afternoon. Tomorrow at 5:30, our live stream will be for our children's church, and the focus is going to be palm leaves and hot cross buns, but all are welcome, whatever their age. Thank you. Have a very good evening. Goodbye.